big welcome back, Matt, Teshin. So Teshin is and has been the resident teacher and priest at the North Carolina Zen Center that's just outside of Chapel Hill in North Carolina. He lives there with his wife, Dana, and their recently formally adopted daughter, Arya. Teshin is, you could say his day job is a licensed professional counselor, but the interweaving of that work with his Zen training and Zen teaching has been quite profound for him. Just a little about his background. He began practicing Zen in 1993, taught by his English professor how to sit Zazen. And that professor was a student of Philip Kapleau. So before long, Matt Teshin began spending his summers in Rochester and eventually moved there and started in with Philip Kapleau, but quickly moved to one of Kapleau's Dharma successors, actually another one, Lawson Sachter, and did the koan training that was the Rochester curriculum together with him. I find this so lovely. In 2002, Teshin, together with a small group of dedicated practitioners, moved to Asheville, North Carolina, where they formed a Sangha, a Zen center that was called the Wind Horse Zen Community. And there he was ordained, and there he also began to formally study psychology. So he eventually went back to school in counseling. He did some very interesting postgraduate work that was quite meaningful to him. And I think from the way he describes it, launched him into this work as a counselor that so enriches his work as a Zen teacher. Not long after arriving at the North Carolina Zen Center, Teshin reached out to Henry, and they began walking side by side in this koan study. And just recently, more recently this year, I've had the real privilege and pleasure of working together with Teshin. He's also part of our the teacher training conversation that Henry and I have been convening, and has been enriching that so much. So Teshin, welcome back to Mountain Cloud. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. How is the sound? Sound okay? Okay.
Very good.
As it was last time, I'm here in the Zendo here with a number of our Sangha in front of me, behind the camera. So good to have everybody here. And thank you, Valerie and Henry, for the invitation back. It's good to be back. And I guess it's official. You're all now allowed to drink your pumpkin spice coffee, tea on this first day of spring, this autumn equinox. I was just thinking, well, I wonder if anybody here is from the southern hemisphere, where it wouldn't be the autumn equinox. I was thinking about a trip I took to Florida, since I'll be heading to Florida on Saturday. I was thinking as a kid, I was in Florida, and I remember asking a native Floridian if they had fall time. And this older man looked at me and said, "Of course we do." I said, "Wait, it doesn't seem like it. It's fall, it doesn't seem like fall time." And he said, you just don't see it. You just don't see it. That was a good Dharma lesson. It's still quite warm here in North Carolina, but the mornings are getting cool. They're cooling off finally, and the light's getting a little more diffuse. The leaves are tumbling down now. And I have to say that even just a few days ago, and thinking about what I would talk about tonight, I didn't know it was going to be the fall equinox. I didn't know it was going to be the first day of fall. And so I had this whole other kind of strain of talk going, and then realizing Thursday would be this first day of fall. So how could I not take up this very beautiful koan invoking Master Unmon from the Blue Cliff record, case 27. A student asked Unmon, "What is it when the branches wither and the leaves fall?" And Unmon replied, "Body exposed in the golden wind." Body exposed in the golden wind. So it seems like just yesterday that we were welcoming spring and summer, welcoming the warmth. And then summer began, and all the activities exploding with life, and vacations and traveling, this kind of turning outwards that happens every spring and summer. And it seemed like, at least here in our Sangha, almost every week during one of the sits, afterwards, somebody would come up to me and say that they wouldn't be in the Zendo because they would be on vacation, traveling, going on vacation here or there. And so as we come to this, now into this fall season, and people settle back in, at least here in our Zendo, I'm looking forward to this increased activity, this increased Dharma activity coming up here in early October. We have our celebrating Bodhidharma with a traditional ceremony that we do, the founder of Zen in China. And then our fall Teshin in October, in November, people here people who are ready, wanting to take the precepts in Jukai, we do that. And then in late November, we have our annual ceremony of gratitude, which was something that was started by Philip Kaplow at the Rochester Zen Center. He was always very fond of that time of year. And of course, at the center of all this Dharma activity is Zazen, this silent sitting, this activity of no activity, a turning inwards. It's like fall time as the great slowing process happens, this life, the sap, the tree sap returning to its roots. I was thinking back to, I wasn't there at the time, but thinking back to the Rochester Zen Center when Philip Kaplow was invited to teach there back in the 1960s. And he was asked why Rochester. And he said that the cold of Rochester was good for Zen practice as it drives people inwards, which is not an easy task, and so many things, so many ideas, so many memories constantly asking for our attention, pulling us in all kinds of directions. It can feel like when we sit down for Zazen, that it's like this fervent activity of summer. Right? And that's, of course, why it's so important that when we sit down for Zazen, or even before, I often say this to students, even before, as we maybe make our way to the Zendo or to our sitting place in our house, into our space, that we very consciously turn towards letting go of all of those many concerns that can so easily take over, to put those gardens to rest, gardens of regret, of worry, of planning, to not constantly turn over that soil. And that is really one of the dangers of that we have to be aware of in our sitting practice, right? That as we sit and we still the body, it can so easily just become another time to ruminate. Like, it's okay, it's finally quiet. Now I can think it all through. I can start planning for those holidays or what have you. Continually nourishing those very familiar neural pathways. And as I've spoken about here, part of the reason that we do that is because there is such a pleasure that we get when we turn to our thoughts over and over again. It can feel in a way so good to escape into our thoughts at times, of course. I remember a few years ago reading this critique of mindfulness. And the author said that she thought that daydreaming was such a perfect escape, such a perfect remedy for doing the dishes. She said, why would I want to give that up? We might laugh at that or kind of take that lightly, but it is so tempting, so pleasurable to indulge as a kind of escape. It can actually be quite scary for some to let go of those familiar soundtracks that we play over and over again. And for some, letting go of that familiar, comforting territory of thought can also be very terrifying, even destabling. What lies beneath oftentimes that superficial worrying and planning and regretting. There often can be these stickier feelings, these warded off parts of ourselves that we just rather not face. Many times when people come to a practice like Zen, they already feel very exposed and like bare, from trauma, sometimes being stripped of their individuality through abuse. And so the natural impulse can be to hide and protect those branches. And so, this is to say that there is a place in Zen for building rather than stripping down. Sometimes what's needed is to spend time building our capacity to observe our thoughts and feelings, and as they come and go, rather than trying to get rid of them, to be able to observe our bodily sensations, the sometimes difficult, painful sensations that we have in our body, to gradually tolerate difficult emotions as they arise without suppressing them, denying them, trying to change them. And it brings to mind this quote that I've had rattling around in my head for many years by this psychiatry professor, this Harvard psychiatry professor and Buddhist practitioner named Jack Engler. And he said that often we have to become somebody before we can become nobody. We have to be somebody before we can be nobody. He also said that the Buddhist teaching that one has no enduring self is open to fateful misinterpretation in our Western context, namely that I don't need to struggle to find out who I am, what my desires and aspirations are, what my needs are, what my capabilities and responsibilities are, how I'm relating to others, and what I should do with my life. So when we think about letting go, we might ask, is it an attempt to get rid of something, to bypass something that we can't really tolerate, that we find too difficult to work through? And if so, perhaps we're misusing the practice. As I said recently to some students here, letting go is really not something that we need to do, but rather it's something that happens when we don't interfere with things as they are, when we don't try to stop experience. And so going back to the koan for today, this student asks, what is it when the branches wither and the leaves fall? What is it you could say when all those familiar thoughts do quiet, when there is nothing in the mind, when all those well-worn pathways simply stop? A number of years ago, I got curious about the process of how trees lose their leaves, and found out that on deciduous trees, there are the stems of the leaves, which are called petioles. I think that's how you pronounce it. This protective part that form this layer before they fall, this protective layer that acts as a barrier between this place where the leaf falls from, so that disease doesn't come into the tree, entering that exposed tissue. And this process begins as the daylight diminishes and as the temperatures decrease. And so it begins, I'm told, on the outer layers of the tree. And then as those leaves drop, then the interior leaves begin the same process. Eventually, a hard frost comes and any of remaining leaves fall. And in thinking about this gradual process is such a beautiful metaphor for how we can work in our practice, gradually exposing ourselves more and more as we ripen. So I guess all of this is to say that sometimes in practice, we need time to ground, to develop mindfulness, to get settled in mindful awareness, to develop our capacity to be here. And yet, as helpful as that may be, if we stay there, then we only experience a fraction of what the masters are showing us. As Henry has said in the past in some of his talks that I've listened to, he said it would be like, it's like beginning to climb a mountain and only to stop a quarter or halfway up the mountain and finding a nice shade tree and settling in, making this comfortable nest. So to keep going, to not settle for this cozy little spot. And in thinking about why people do stop, it's not always that people find a cozy little spot, but sometimes people can stop because they feel dried up, uninspired to keep going. And so we may at times when we feel like that go to a teacher looking for inspiration, for reassurance, and that would be important to do if you don't have a teacher to connect with one, so that they can encourage you to go deeper. But what they might also encourage you to do is to go into that withered up dryness, not away from it. It might be that we need to become more creative with our practice. I remember one of these dried up times myself many years ago. I was in Teshin, just doing sesshin after sesshin, retreat after retreat, hitting this wall over and over again, and just getting fed up and marching into Doksan, these individual meetings with the teacher, slamming the door and not knowing what I was going to do, and just walking over to the student's mat and just for some weird reason, just doing a headstand, just standing on my head right in the middle and then tumbling over right into my teacher's lap. So desperate to shake things up. And so in practice, we need to learn how to shake things up at times. One of the ways that we might do that is by working on a koan, something that takes us out of our comfort zone, that shakes our leaves. One of those ways that the leaves stay on the tree a little longer than they should is through this kind of knowing, this wanting to know, looking for more knowledge. For example, when I meet with people for therapy, oftentimes the process involves helping people put their experiences, their life experiences, into a greater context, helping them see the arc of their life. And yet, if we aren't careful as a partnership, what can happen is it can just become kind of an intellectual exercise, something that really doesn't change somebody. Sometimes people want explanation after explanation, really unconsciously avoiding direct experience of their emotional lives and facing what they need to face. But as the famous psychoanalyst Frieda Fromm-Reichmann said, that we are in need of an experience, not an explanation. Explanations, again, they don't change us. And all that self-understanding, all that knowledge, self-knowledge that we can accumulate can just become an extension of this neurotic self, craving more and more becomes kind of self-defeating. We don't need, in the same vein, we don't need really to know anything about Zen or Buddhism. The masters weren't teaching in the classic sense of the word, but rather showing their students directly what they are looking for. It really reminds me of a well-known Zen master's journey, Master Kyogen. I don't know his Chinese original name, who resigned himself to living as a simple grave tender after becoming so disheartened with Zen practice. And the story goes that one day his own teacher, Isan, asked him to say something from the time before he was born. Say something. And Kyogen was so confused that he couldn't answer. And so he asked Isan to explain it. And Isan said, if I explain it, that would be merely my understanding and not yours. And so after that Doksan, Kyogen went back to his room or wherever he was staying and searched through all of his books for an answer that would satisfy him and couldn't. Famously saying, a picture of a cake does not satisfy hunger. And then, in somewhat dramatic fashion, I'm sure, burned all of his books. He packed up his bag and ended up settling in to be this grave tender of the national teacher's gravesite. And as he was scything grass one day, a small piece of tile flicked off the end of his blade and hit a piece of bamboo. And with that, his mind completely opened. We're told that he bowed in the direction of Isan, his former teacher, so filled with gratitude, and said, if you had explained it back then, how could this have come to pass? And he also wrote a verse after this awakening experience. And as a part of it, he said, one strike and everything I know is forgotten. You could say in that moment, Kyogen was more like a ginkgo tree. A ginkgo tree loses all of its leaves in one single go. Back when I was a resident in Rochester at the center there, we used to bet on the day of when the ginkgo in the garden would lose its leaves. When is it going to be? Nothing left. Totally open. As Kyogen said in another part of this enlightenment verse, far and wide, not a trace is left. In every direction, this realized way. The question is, when we are ready, when we feel grounded enough, how do we experience this for ourselves? As some of my students here know, I'm very fond of this text called This Cloud of Unknowing. It's a 14th century European text written by some anonymous monk as sort of an instruction manual for his students or student. And it gives us a hint, which may sound familiar to all of us Zen practitioners. And I just want to read this one small passage as he instructs his student. He says, "Take but a little word of one syllable, for so it is better than of two. For ever shorter it is, the better it accords with the work of the Spirit. And such a word is this word God, or this word love. And fasten this word to your heart. This word shall be your shield and your spear, whether you ride on peace or on war. With this word, you smite down all manner of thought under this cloud of unknowing." I don't know about any of you, but to me, this sounds very familiar, like the instructions we receive when we work with this one word, mu, or who, putting all of our thought under this cloud of mu. So coming back to our koan today, this monk asks, what is it when the branches wither and the leaves fall? Could it be where this is where this monk is? In this cloud of unknowing, totally open. Unmon replies, body exposed in the golden wind. Unmon was one of the last great masters of the Tang era in China. And his responses are said to have three qualities: that they cover like heaven and earth, like a box in its lid, that they cut off the flow of discursive thoughts, and that each of his responses rides the waves and follows the currents. And in other words, according perfectly with the student's needs. I would say that everything, not just Unmon's responses, his teachings, but everything perfectly accords, is in perfect harmony, covering heaven and earth. Another translation of Unmon's response is complete manifestation of the golden wind. We are all manifesting this golden wind right now. Everything right now is golden wind. All this imagery of falling leaves reminds me of an old proverb, which says, a falling leaf is a whisper to the living. A fallen leaf is a whisper to the living. It's a reminder, of course, that all things pass and to live fully. The other night during our Tuesday night discussion group, one of the students said that they always dreaded fall because they knew what was coming. All the cold. But they said that with practice, that dread had lessened. It had abated some. And as I listened to him say that, I had two thoughts. One was, great. The less dread, the better. Right? But the other thought was, keep that dread close, that fear. It's the great motivator for practice. Fold it into your practice so it can be resolved fully. So this proverb, a falling leaf is a whisper to the living, while it's a reminder of impermanence, it's much more than that, to my mind. This simple act of one leaf falling is a presentation of the whole. It is showing us this whole world, just as everything is showing us this whole world, fully manifested. Each thing in its particularity, and yet it somehow, mysteriously, each thing, one body. One body. Another Zen master, Master Balin, was once asked, what is the sharpest sword? You could maybe say, for us Buddhists, what is the sword of Manjushri, the sword that cuts in one? Balin's response was, each coral branch reflects the moon. Each thing reflecting the whole. This practice is so refreshing. So before we end, just come back to this simple breath, like an autumn breeze. Just gently blowing those paper thin, dried out leaves of self-concern, of self and other, right and wrong. Just great clearing out. And so just to end with a poem from Master Unmon, or Unmon from The Gateless Gate, one of my favorites. He says, 10,000 flowers in spring, the moon in autumn, a cool breeze in summer, snow in winter. When your mind is not clouded by unnecessary things, no season is too much for you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Valerie, Henry, and Peg, and the whole Mountain Cloud Sangha.